am Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. On Tuesday, Israeli forces demolished a structure used as a quarantine center for people suspected of contracting the coronavirus in the West Bank city of Hebron. This comes as cases of infections rise in the West Bank. On today's show, we discuss how this move fits into the larger scheme of things and how can we understand the evolving situation. Joining us for this conversation today is Mr. Tehseen Elayyan, who's the director of Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organization based in Ramallah, Palestine. Also joining us today is Ms. Beth, the director of international relations at Gaisha, an Israeli human rights organization which works to protect the freedom of movement of Palestinians, especially Gaza residents. She joins us today as an independent analyst from Tel Aviv. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Tehseen Elayyan, I'd like to begin with you. Now let's just dive right into it. From what we know about the nature of this virus, it doesn't respect borders. It spreads extremely fast. Given that situation, how countries all around the world, authorities all around the world are working so hard to contain it, what is the purpose of destructing a center which is supposed to quarantine those who have been infected?
Let me first thank you very much for hosting me to speak to you and to your audience. And let me first just stress the fact that all of Israeli policies on the ground here in the occupied Palestinian territory aim or target the very existence of the Palestinians on this land. Israel does not want the Palestinians to be here in order to entrench its colonial settler enterprise in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That is why Israel is taking or implementing many policies here in order to push Palestinians out of this area. And these policies do not only focus on just what has been happening in the last few months with the spread of the coronavirus. These include house demolitions, include land appropriation, include killing of Palestinians, detention and arrest, settlement expansion, and many other practices that push Palestinians directly and indirectly to leave their land and expand at the same time settler presence in the Palestinian land. We noticed over the past few months with the spread of the coronavirus that there has been not an immediate response by Israeli occupying authorities to deal with the impact of the virus on the Palestinians. This was very clear in Jerusalem. Israel declared that the first case of coronavirus was discovered in Jerusalem in March, and they did not take any step in order to deal with the spread of this virus until early April. And not only that, when the Palestinian Authority tried to fill in the gap as a result of Israel's inaction in accordance with its legal obligations under international law, they did not even allow Palestinians to take any role in that. Some of the Palestinians got arrested because they tried to clean and sterilize public spaces and streets in order to protect Palestinians from the spread of this virus. Some people even got arrested. Some medical centers got shut down under the reasoning that these centers are not licensed by the Israeli authorities. This is just a pretext. They do not want Palestinians to be present, especially in Jerusalem, and they do not want them to show any sign of their presence there.
Right. Mr. Elayyan, stay with me. I'm going to jump to Ms. Beth Oppenheim and talk to her about everything that you've said here. Ms. Beth Oppenheim, when we discuss how the authorities have been dealing with the pandemic and how they've been dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the same time, What do you see happening?
I think the first thing to say is that these news stories over the last few days about demolitions of medical facilities in Hebron and Jenin have been garnering a lot of attention. There's still a lack of clarity around the circumstances, whether they were indeed health facilities or private Palestinian land. That's something that is being investigated by local human rights organizations as we speak. But I think what's important to say is that the land in question is in Area C, as divided up by the Oslo Accords, and that area is under full Israeli control. And what we've been seeing here during this period is really a continuation of existing trends. So basically, the Palestinians who wish to build in Area C of the West Bank are required to request permits from the Israeli civil administration, which is a very opaque process. There's no consistency, there's no transparency. And we see that 98.6% of Palestinian applications to build in Area C from 2016 to 2018 were denied. And that creates a situation where Palestinians, but also humanitarian organizations, are forced to build without these permits from the Israeli authorities and then run the risk of demolition by the Israeli defense forces. As my colleague said, we've seen a sharp increase in demolitions in June alone. According to B'Tselem, another human rights organization, Israel demolished 30 Palestinian homes in the West Bank. That's more than in the first 5 months of 2020. So we've seen that actually, in spite of the health crisis and the very dire circumstances for Palestinians living in the West Bank as it is, there has been no let-up in Israel's policy. And I think it's important to say that this really fits into a broader picture of dispossession and of population control, particularly in Area C of the West Bank, which is the area where most Jewish settlers live, and it's the least densely populated area by Palestinians. It also has much of the most fertile land for farming in the West Bank. This is where Israel has been locating the majority of its creeping policy of annexation in the West Bank. So we've had a lot of conversation around formal annexation recently with the new Israeli coalition government agreement, Netanyahu promising to annex formally by the 1st of July. But I think what's often left out of the discussion is the reality on the ground, the creeping annexation and the settlement enterprise, which Israel has been pursuing for decades. So the demolitions that we've seen over the last few weeks is really a continuation of that, of Israel's demographic engineering of the Palestinian territory to try to ensure maximum land and minimum Palestinians.
Right. Now, to this point, I talk about this move and the demolitions, as you've mentioned, have spiked up quite considerably in the month of June. One would assume that with the health crisis, that wouldn't have happened. But that happening with condemnations pouring all across the world against Israel's move to annex the West Bank. Let's talk about how that comes across to the international audience. Does the Israeli authorities even care about how that looks like at this point in time?
So I think it's a very valid question. It's one that the international community is grappling with now, is actually how far is the international community willing to go in terms of a response to Israel's at least stated intentions of formal annexation. I think the question of formal annexation in some ways is a slight red herring, because as both of us have just outlined, this is a process that has been going on under the radar for a very long time. And there's a concern, I think, that if the international community feels a sense of relief should Israel not carry out de jure annexation, or should Israel carry out only a so-called modest de jure annexation, then perhaps the international community will see itself as somehow let off the hook and the status quo can resume, which of course is very dangerous. I think in reality, there's a great deal of reluctance from the international community to intervene with Israel. Of course, we have Trump in the White House, which is an unprecedented situation in terms of Israel-US relations. The US has never been friendlier to Israel. And of course, that's something that Netanyahu recognizes very well, and is partly why he wanted to rush through this annexation decision before the US election later this year. The other point, of course, is the European Union, who you might hope would do something about this. The EU has invested a great deal of money, a great deal of diplomatic energy in the Middle East peace process.
Stay with me. We're going to come back to what you're pointing out here. How much, to what extent, how much willpower there is for actual intervention. I want to come back to this point later on. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Tehseen Elayyan and talk to him about something that you've mentioned, something that he's mentioned, that these demolitions aren't new. This has been happening for decades. The momentum, the aggressiveness might perhaps be new, but this has been happening for a long time. Mr. Elayyan, when we talk about what's happening in the West Bank, also what's happening in Gaza in the context of the current pandemic, it's important to discuss how the health infrastructure has been impacted, how it exists today, given what's happened in the past. Give us some insight into that.
Actually, everything that is going on here is interrelated. When we speak about the widespread of the coronavirus and the pandemic, people at least need, those who are affected or who come into contact with these people affected, need at least some place to be quarantined, to use it as a quarantine, to not only as a house. We are not only speaking about the right to adequate housing here. If people get infected and they do not find a house in order to be quarantined in, this is a very big problem. This applies especially in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is one of the mostly affected areas by the pandemic these days. And up till now, dozens of houses have been demolished in Jerusalem. This means that Israel does not even care about what happens to the Palestinians. Needless to say anything about their responses to what the Palestinians are trying to do to prevent the widespread of the pandemic.
Right, Mr. Elayyan, but prior to the pandemic as well, when we talk about the state of healthcare, how would you describe it?
Healthcare in general in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Some people die. Some people die because Israel does not allow them to leave Gaza in order to receive, for example, medical care in the West Bank or even inside Israel itself. Some of the very serious cases who suffer from cancer, for example, they die waiting for a permit in order to leave the Gaza Strip without even getting this permit. And they sometimes are put under pressure by Israeli authorities in order to give something in return for such a permit. And they do not even get it. Maybe my colleague from Gisha knows this very well because they work well on the right to freedom of movement, especially between the West Bank and Gaza, and how sick people cannot come to the West Bank or even to Israel or leave the country in order to receive such medication.
Right. Ms. Oppenheim, as we know that these medical permits have declined, the issuance of them have declined in recent years. The World Health Organization itself has documented this, how there has been quite a significant decrease from each year onwards. What is the purpose of this, not issuing health permits? I don't want to take this question for granted and assume that we are all on the same page. Why is this policy being pursued with such rigor?
I think the backdrop to this, of course, is the disengagement in 2005 when Israel withdrew its troops and its settlers from the Gaza Strip. And then Hamas took power by force and pushed the Palestinian Authority out shortly after that. And Israel, since that point in 2006, has used the pretext of security to impose stringent, severe restrictions on the Gaza Strip and on its civilian population by extension. And the closure of Gaza has resulted in the humanitarian crisis that you so often hear mentioned, in a decaying healthcare system, chronic shortages in skilled medical staff, medicine, equipment, and vulnerable patients having to leave the Gaza Strip for treatment if they are even able to receive a permit. So, of course, as we've already said, this is really an ongoing trend, but during the pandemic, this has become even more acute. We've seen people struggling to exit the Strip for medical care. During the pandemic, before the suspension of coordination by the Palestinian Authority, which we'll come on to, already before that, we were seeing basically cancer patients who were very scared to leave the Gaza Strip in order to access their usual chemotherapy treatment or radiotherapy treatment, which, by the way, is not allowed inside the Gaza Strip because that requires materials that are considered dual use by Israel, so they're not permitted to come into the Strip. So it's this absurd situation where vulnerable people have to leave the Strip in order to access the most basic life-saving medical care. And that's become complicated recently by the suspended coordination of the Palestinian Authority as a result of the threat to annexation by the Israeli government. So we've seen now that the Palestinian Committee that's based inside the Gaza Strip, run by the Palestinian Authority, is no longer referring patients for medical care to the Israeli authorities at Erez Crossing. That's caused major problems for people's access to medical care. Of course, the onus is on Israel as the occupying power to provide a way for people to access medical treatment. Regardless of what the Palestinian Authority decides to do, Israel is the occupying power under international law. It's Israel's responsibility to ensure people have access to medical care, and that has not been the case. People have basically encountered major bureaucratic hurdles. There's been a complete lack of clarity on the permit procedures since the suspended coordination. We've even seen casualties. Basically, we had an 8-month-old baby in Gaza who died last month after his heart surgery was postponed again. So even urgent treatment is being held up. And of course, there are many people like cancer patients, for instance, who remain unable to access routine treatment, which may come at the cost of their lives too.
Ms. Oppenheim, I'm going to come back to this that I put on very early on, right before we started our conversation, which was knowing that the nature of this virus is one that it requires it to be contained in all hotspots for a region to be completely rid of it. Isn't this working against Israel in itself when they're denying the Palestinian people the basic needs and facilities required to contain this virus?
Absolutely. As you said, of course, it knows no boundaries whatsoever, unlike Israel's discriminatory regime that it runs throughout the occupied territory. And it seems extremely counterproductive for Israel, just from a basic health aspect, for Israel to be demolishing homes, making people homeless at a time when we're all being told that we need to stay home, we need to stay socially distanced in order to save lives.
Right. It makes absolutely no sense if you're displacing people, if you're demolishing their homes during a time when people are told to stay within their homes, maintain social distance in order to curtail this virus, in order to flatten the curve. Mr. Tehseen, Elayyan, we touched upon this earlier on, and I said we were going to come back to it, which is outside intervention into what is happening now. We know that the United States has emboldened Netanyahu's government, but we are also seeing a stance being taken by the European Union. Are you hopeful?
Actually, to be honest with you, people here on the ground have lost faith in the international legal justice system, and they need action. They have been waiting for action to be taken by the international community in order to at least hold Israeli officials who allegedly committed international crimes against Palestinians to be held accountable. And so far, we have not seen this. So we are a little optimistic now because of what steps Europe is expected to take in case Israel goes ahead with its annexation plans. But at the same time, we are not very sure that concrete steps, really concrete steps would be taken. So we never trust what is said in the media. And people too here do not trust what is said in the media. So we have to wait and see concrete steps. We have been calling for sanctions to be imposed on Israel, and we have been calling on all states to uphold their legal obligations as third state parties to end Israel's occupation as the root cause of the conflict. But so far, we have not seen this. And I do not want to lose hope. We have to wait and see what will happen.
Right. Beth, Oppenheim, when we're talking about all of this, and Mr. Elayyan has said that there needs to be actual action for people on the ground to believe that something's going to come out of these condemnations, one thing that I do want to talk about is it seems like there is this renewed energy with which Israel is being condemned for the annexation plans. Do you think that that could possibly translate into action that didn't exist prior to this? Because of with how countries are coming out and condemning Israel, it seems like they're no longer sitting on the fence, but blatantly saying what you're doing is wrong, and they're warning Israel against it.
I think we've heard a lot of statements in the past, particularly from the European Union. It's famous for uttering paper-thin statements with no real consequences. So I think best to take statements with a pinch of salt when it comes to the EU. But I do agree with you that I think there is a renewed energy. I think the risk, as I said earlier, is that perhaps there's a diversion going on of everyone's attention is focused on this elusive de jure annexation. When will it happen? How much will Israel decide to annex? And actually, that's a distraction. But I think in a way, what's good is that this, this attention towards de jure annexation has really called into question existing policy by the international community, particularly the European Union. It's forced actors like the EU to take a hard look at themselves and to think about how is it that despite the amount of money and energy that has been invested into dealing with this conflict, actually in a way, well-intentioned actors like the EU have actually enabled the current situation by allowing Israel to behave with impunity, by deepening ties, bilateral relationships with Israel, as Israel has continued to tear up the international rule book, violate international law, and it's actually just been rewarded for that, essentially, against the backdrop of condemnations and statements, but actually materially nothing very much, with a few small exceptions, has changed for Israel, despite the policy that it's carrying out. So I think perhaps now is a moment for actors like the EU to reconsider policy. And there is some optimism, I think, on very specific policies. But
we're going to have to wait and see. We're going to wait and see if actual actions are taken. That is a very strong point you make there, Ms. Oppenheim. And we're going to end this segment on that very point, that there is a disconnect between the declarative policy and what's actually happening on the ground. I mean, if Israel is being constantly rewarded for its policies, condemnations really don't do much at this point. Thank you so much, Ms. Beth Oppenheim, for joining us from Tel Aviv, Mr. Tehseen Elayyan for joining us from Ramallah. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we discuss the European Union's massive $858 billion bailout plan. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, as Europe deals with the worst economic shock since World War II because of the COVID-19 pandemic, member states have been debating what needs to be done for the economies. After days of intense discussions, the European Union leaders have come up with a landmark €750 billion, which translates into $858 billion plan to rescue the bloc's economies. Let's discuss further what this plan means for the EU's recovery. Joining us for this conversation today is Professor Steve Keen, who's the author of the book Debunking Economics and Distinguished Research Fellow at the University College London. He joins us from Trang. Also joining us today is Mr. Klaus Jürgens, who's a political analyst and a journalist who joins us from Tyrol. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Klaus Jürgens, I'm going to jump to you first and talk to you about how massive is this news for the EU?
It is indeed absolutely massive news. Now, you must remember that before the pandemic broke out, the coronavirus pandemic, the EU was pretty much busy with trying to come to terms with Brexit. There were literally other issues on the agenda, including some outbreaks of far-right populism, climate change, you name it. Now, all of a sudden, the pandemic happened, and I think it is good to see, I will come back to that point, that the EU is speaking with one voice, we will come back to that too, and says we have a financial responsibility to take care of our economies. Now, having said that, what I equally appreciate is that member states no longer simply swallow whatever comes from a number of the bigger capitals, but in the case of Austria, for example, from where I'm speaking, I wouldn't call them the angry dirt. I would call them the more hesitant four plus Finland. They simply said, we want to have a stronger say about the finances. We agree with an economic aid package, but we want to have not only loans, we want to have grants, we want to have a fair mixture of what you repay. It is massive indeed. It shows the EU can still speak with a voice in a still ongoing pandemic, but a post-Brexit evolving world.
Right. Now, there are a couple of points that I want to pick up from here, but let's start with trying to describe the nature of this bailout plan. As you mentioned, that other nations have had a say, and they've said that we don't just want loans, we want grants. How do we break down this deal into grants and loans?
Well, I think after the last 50 billion discussion, I think the amount is now lowered to 450 billion, which is still a massive amount. I'm sorry for using the word massive one more time. Now, you must understand the worries smaller states have. They say we do not want to have a European Union based on money which is basically given away for free in the form of non-repayable grants. We want to see loans which over a long extended period of time have to be paid back. And secondly, ideally, we want to have a say for what these monies are actually used. Will they simply be sent to member states' finance ministries, or will they actually be debated in Brussels before they are disbursed? In the same way, pre-accession funding for example, Turkey was managed. You have a certain amount of money, a project is agreed upon, the money is out. I think this is what the smaller countries this time really wanted to achieve. We don't want to have the whole amount given away. Initially, it was said 50 billion could be the icebreaker, and as we by now know, it was actually 300 billion which were renegotiated. Should it be loans or should it be non-repayable grants?
Right. Mr. Jürgens, yes. Stay with me. I'm going to come back and discuss the nature of this bailout package. We're also going to talk about what it implies in terms of the green recovery plans for the EU. But before that, I'm going to talk to Professor Steve Keen. Professor Steve Keen, when we talk about how the European Union's economy has been hit and how it's worse than the struggles after World War II, is this amount going to stabilize the economy?
It'll help, but it won't stabilise the economy. The main destabilising factor in the European Union has been, first of all, the insistence on minimising government debt while ignoring what's happening with the private sector. So you have some of the most privately indebted economies on the planet in the European Union, with private debt levels of up over 200% of GDP, well over the level of America and the UK. So these households are struggling with debts and firms struggling with debts that, of course, they can't pay right now because the cash flow has evaporated courtesy of the coronavirus. So something is necessary, and it's incredible that it's taken so long for the European Union to join the same party that even America with Donald Trump has got into, of the government providing the cash flow to stop the private sector going bankrupt because of the disruption caused by the coronavirus.
Right. Now, when we talk about the disruption caused by the coronavirus, how the economies are so globalized, supply chains are so globalized, something that is happening in the European Union, economies of such a huge scale, how will that translate into global impact, if any at all?
Well, I think this is something which is actually fragmenting the globe and making it, rather than a global economy, we now have a large number of separate national economies. Globalization, in fact, set us up for a disease like this because it enabled the disease to travel far more rapidly than it would have done if we practiced the other extreme, which is autarky, where each economy tries to provide for its own needs. Now we're being forced into that because you simply don't want to have, obviously, tourism from countries without the virus to countries with, and even transferring goods is problematic when that involves shipping, with shipping crews which have to be quarantined either side of a journey across the ocean, in which they could, if they start off infected, they will arrive massively infected. If they arrive and then go into the community, they could pick up the disease and bring it back. All these things mean that the days of a globalized economy, I think, are over.
Right. Sir Stephen, we're going to talk a little more about the impact of this and what is to be expected if there is a second outbreak of the coronavirus, how that will fit into this plan of this bailout package. Mr. Klaus Jürgens, now you mentioned earlier on, and I want to get back to it because I think it's a very important point to discuss, how this entire scenario, this entire decision that was made reflects the unity in the European Union. How do you think that's strengthened by this decision? And what exactly would be the political implications of that?
Well, I think indeed, let's assume Corona would not have happened. The EU would have had to come up with plans to revitalize itself in the foreign policy making domain, in social issues, in climate change, you name it. Now, Corona has pushed this to the limit. As my esteemed colleague said, basically the bailout package is not meant for governments, but actually helping governments to stimulate the private sector one more time, which was so badly hit by the coronavirus. Now, I think it shows unity and disunity at the same time. Brussels will not allow a further breakup, and I mean, if they can avoid it. They want to have a Brexit, an orderly Brexit, no hard Brexit, and then it is done and dusted. What they really have to achieve is that the remaining member states have something to chew on, are given something to say it is actually worth while being a member in the EU. No better point in time than during a crisis. Initially, the EU was so much challenged and criticized, in particularly the European Commission, for reacting too late, reacting not at all, waiting up and wait and see and what is going to happen. Italy had a point in case here to say this. Now they have come together, as my colleague said, albeit belatedly, and say we have to step in. We cannot let Europe go down. I think this is a very interesting point, almost dating back to the founding fathers and the treaties of Rome, to say we must come out of a huge, devastating crisis, not comparable, of course, to a war, but it is a crisis of enormous proportions. So unity, yes. The smaller countries which were rebelling against, with the support of Finland, they were 5, as we all know. They said, we do not want to buy into everything which comes from Paris and Berlin. We want to have our say. We want a solidarity European Union, but not a free-for-all European Union. I think it is a risky approach, but for the time being, the EU has survived. It will survive the post-Brexit, the initial years. Should there be a second lockdown? Should there be a second catastrophe waiting upon along the horizon? I don't know how this will end. Is the money enough for bailout package? Yes. Would it last for 5 years and, God forbid, 2 or 3 more outbreaks of this virus, as we have seen before? I am very doubtful.
Right, Mr. Jürgens, jump back to Professor Steve Keen. Just one question to this. Many experts are saying this goes one step ahead of just unity. It goes to one step towards federalism, greater federalism within the EU. Do you see that as well?
Possible. One answer to this post-Brexit world is that we do have a European superstate, which the British side so much challenged and criticized, but that we have more say for the regions, for the individual member states, stopping one moment short of a full-fledged federalist union. But I can imagine that in the near and medium-term future, not only linked to Corona, the smaller states will actually say, what kind of Europe do we want? How can we contribute? What do we get back? What is the benefit? What do we have to ship in to make it workable? Yes, but full-fledged federalism, I think there would come, to name only one country, I think Hungary and Poland and some others would be rather lukewarm to very hesitant to allow a full-fledged Europe of the regions where the nation state has basically nothing to say.
Right. I take your point. Professor Steve Keen, on this issue of these bailout packages, and I think this applies generally more to the global aspect as opposed to just the European Union, this discussion about what happens if there is a second outbreak, a third outbreak. What are the contingency plans there? What measures can we take in all these discussions that are being had, everything that has been learned from the first massive outbreak, which caused lockdowns all across the world? Where are the experts heading towards? Which direction? What conclusions?
The main conclusion coming out of this is what's being pushed by the theory known as modern monetary theory right now, that the state has no limit on its capacity to create money. And that means that if you have a crisis which debilitates the private sector, then at least in terms of the cash flows, the government can make up the difference. And if we don't do that in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, then we'll have large parts of the private sector going bankrupt, which will only make worse the transmissibility of the virus itself. People being made homeless, so on and so forth. You can't expect people who are kicked out of homes they can no longer afford to pay for with rental payments or mortgages to simultaneously, wear masks and not transmit the virus. So we have to basically put capitalism on hold. And the most effective countries that have actually managed to defeat the virus completely are ones that have done that, have said we're going to provide state funding to enable the private sector to get over this period where private sector cash flows not only collapse but have to collapse. Thailand, where I currently live, is one of those countries. New Zealand is another. Mongolia, Vietnam, Cambodia. These countries have all managed to completely eliminate the virus. And they did that by giving the private sector government-based cash flows in the meantime, letting the system reset after the crisis is over and trying to revive capitalism when the crisis has passed. Europe, America, South America have to learn from what the Asians have in Southeast Asia have done successfully, and that's enable capitalism to go into deep freeze, maintain its cash flows through government money, and then after that let it restart.
That's such an interesting point, and I think creates a good segue into the next question that I'm going to put to Mr. Klaus Jürgens. Mr. Jürgens, when we talk about capitalism being put on pause and trying to do something that goes beyond it, that conversation, of course, also comes to discuss sustainable recovery. Now, what are the EU's plans of this bailout package aligning with its Green Deal?
That is an interesting point. In the press conference and when finally a compromise was hammered out, a few hours, almost days, definitely one day later than expected. Now, climate change and a greener world is one of the key measures member states now have to comply with regards to how to actually spend the money. It is no longer just saying we want to work as we did before, the same sectors, no change, no environmental considerations, climate change is not going to happen. Exactly the opposite. So the EU has very cleverly come up with a plan to use the corona pandemic and the ensuing problems in the economy now to recalibrate its economic approach to make it more green. I think this is a very, very positive point. On the question of has capitalism put on hold? Well, we have to be honest. Where I live right now, one company only announced yesterday they have to lay off, instead of 200 members of staff, 1,200 members of staff. And this will not be the last such incident. So capitalism is for sure on hold. But my worry is if the state doesn't step in, what happens to all the people who are out of a job? What happens to a complete generation, perhaps again a lockdown, 1 or 2 with distance learning, which will not work perfectly well as it did last time, at least in some countries. So the state has to step in, capitalism on hold.
Mr. Klaus Jürgens, since I'm short on time, I want to take this question that you're putting here to Professor Steve Keen. Professor Steve Keen, while capitalism is on pause, but we know that economic recovery might not align with the green deals that countries have put forth. How do we see the sustainable future?
Well, I think this has to be a wake-up call in terms of the climate. I can't say directly that climate change caused coronavirus, but you can say what's causing climate change is the same thing that caused the coronavirus, and that is far too much pressure from humanity on the sustainable ecology of the biosphere. So we have to take this as a major hint and go further in the direction the virus has already pushed us in, with a dramatic drop in power consumption, less energy, and make sure that falls exclusively on coal and partially oil, and that solar takes over, and that we also start bringing in nuclear power as well. If we make those changes in the aftermath, then the push that the virus has in some ways usefully given us can go the same way, and we can reduce the pressure we put on the planet. If we don't do that, then this is just going to be a warm-up for what the rest of the decade is going to throw our way.
Right. I will reiterate that many experts, such as Professor Steve Keen, have also stated, which is that the time to actually take the opportunity, seize the opportunity of sustainable recovery is right now. It can't just be delayed till the aftermath. Thank you so much, Professor Steve Keen, for joining us. Mr. Klaus Jürgens for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.